By the time the second month of Alec Arden's exile came to an end, Blackwake Isle had begun to look less like a place meant for the dead and more like a place stubborn enough to keep producing life. Not gentle life, not comfortable life, but work, order, direction. The ruined shed near Alec's first shelter was now a proper workshop in all but name. Its old half-collapsed roof had been reinforced with salvaged planks from Garen's wrecked skiff. The loose stone walls had been packed tighter with clay and braced from the inside. Shelves lined one side holding rows of fired vessels, cloth filters, rope bundles, and crude tools sorted with the kind of discipline only men who had once owned nothing could maintain. Outside, the open ground had changed too. Collection jars stood drying in the sun. Fuel pits had been marked with stone borders. A second work area had been carved beside the first for cooling and separation. A rough rain catchment stretched between two salvaged beams, its channel directing precious water into sealed basins instead of letting it vanish into the rock. None of it was pretty. Every structure leaned a little. Every beam looked one storm away from regret. The whole place smelled of oil, wet clay, ash, and labor, but it was functioning. That was enough. Alec had long since stopped measuring Blackwake against the standards of the capital. Marble halls and polished banners meant nothing here. On this island, value was measured in sturdier ropes, longer burn times, drier storage, better output, and men who woke up with purpose instead of despair. That was why he was standing on the eastern ridge before dawn, looking out over the dark gray sea with narrowed eyes. Bram Voss was due back, and this time if the captain had done what Alec asked, he would not be bringing only trade, he would be bringing labor. Behind Alec, the island was already awake. Thomas was hauling water before sunrise now without needing to be told. Garen had a habit of waking before everyone else and striking metal against stone just loudly enough to make sleep impossible for weaker men. The old shipwright claimed it was unintentional and no one believed him. Alec listened to the sounds below, the scrape of a shovel, the crackle of the first fire pit, Garen's gravel, rough voice cursing a warped plank, and let his gaze remain on the sea. When the ship finally appeared through the low morning mist, it was larger than before. Not by much, still a modest vessel by royal standards. But the morning tide rode heavier in the water this time, with extra cargo lashed beneath tarp. Near the midsection, Alec's eyes lingered there for a moment, then shifted toward the lower deck. More shadows than usual. Good. By the time Bram's landing boat touched the shore, Alec was already waiting at the beach. Bram stepped out first, coat snapping in the wind boots, sinking slightly into wet sand. Behind him came four men and one woman, all dressed in patched travel clothes, all carrying the careful stillness of people who had run out of better places to go. The captain looked at Alec and smirked and said, "You ask for labor, I bring you labor." Alec's eyes moved over the group one by one. He did not greet them warmly. He did not offer comfort. He studied them the same way he had once studied terrain before a battle. The first was broad and thick-necked with scarred hands and the shoulders of a quarry worker. The second was older, thin-faced, sharp-eyed, and clearly some kind of clerk or tradesman fallen on bad years. The third was a young man with one clouded eye and rope burns along both palms. The fourth had the look of a dock brawler who had learned the hard way that fists did not beat hunger forever. The woman stood slightly apart from them all. She was dressed more simply than the others, but even under travel dust and worn cloth, it was obvious she carried herself differently. Straight spine, watchful eyes, controlled expression. Not noble Alec thought, but educated, or at least used to dealing with people too proud to admit need. Bram noticed his glance and said, "She's not dead weight before you ask." Alec said I wasn't going to ask that. And Bram said dryly, "No. You were going to decide it yourself." Alec faced the group fully and said, "I need workers, not complainers. This island has no room for thieves, drunkards, or men who collapse the first time the wind bites. You work, you eat, you work well, you earn silver, you steal from me, sabotage my men, or spread what you see here without permission." And his voice remained calm, but something in it made even Bram stop smiling. And he said, "Then Blackwake becomes exactly the kind of island the kingdom intended it to be." No one answered immediately, good Alec thought. Let them understand the terms before they start imagining freedom where none has been offered. The broad-shouldered man finally spoke and asked what kind of work. Alex said extraction, carrying, clay shaping, fire management, construction, dock reinforcement, storage, whatever the island requires. The thin-faced older man asked, and if someone knows numbers better than lifting? Alec looked at him and said, then he proves he's worth feeding with numbers. The woman's gaze sharpened slightly at that. Alex said names. The quarry-built man was Darren. The older, narrow-faced one was Olin. The one-eyed youth was Perrin. The brawler-looking man called himself Mac, and the woman after the smallest pause said, Lydia. No family names offered, and Alec did not ask for them. On Blackwake, past lives mattered only if they threatened the future. He led them uphill, and as the new arrivals crossed the ridge and saw the workshop, stills. Drying rows of clay jars, smoke pits, and storage structures below their expressions shifted one by one. First confusion, then disbelief, then calculation. This was no exile camp. Not anymore. Bram watched their faces with visible enjoyment and said, told you cursed rock was making money. Garen, standing outside the workshop with arms folded, looked them over and spat to the side and said, those are the best you found. Bram replied, the best willing to come where I said they were going. Garen said that bad then. Lydia's mouth twitched very slightly, though she hid it well. Alec did not waste more time on introductions. He put them to work before noon. That was deliberate. Hope was dangerous in places like this. Too much of it too early made people careless. The new workers needed to understand Blackwake not as rumor, but as routine. The island would accept them only through labor. Darren and Mac were sent with Garen to expand the storage area and reinforce the main workshed. Perrin and Thomas handled water and clay. Olin stayed near Alec for the day, at Alec's instruction. Not because Alec trusted him, but because the old man's hands were too fine for brute hauling. He watched the refining process with intense, hungry focus, asking only a few questions and never wasting one. Lydia surprised Alec by walking directly to the rows of finished jars and examining the markings scratched into their sides. You separate by batch and source? She asked. Alec looked at her. I do. Why are these marks inconsistent? He stepped closer. She was right. What Alec and Thomas had marked quickly over the last week made sense to them, but not cleanly enough to scale. One notch meant Southern Basin on one row, but sometimes meant second-grade refined product on another. It was a rough system built by men too busy producing to think like merchants. Alec's eyes narrowed. What did you do before this? He asked. Account records, Lydia said. Cargo tallies, port manifests, warehouse inventory. Where? Nowhere that matters. He studied her for a moment longer, then pointed at the jars. Fix it. She blinked once. That's all. No. After you fix the markings, count every finished vessel, every usable clay mold, every tool head, and every storage jar that hasn't cracked. Then tell me what's missing before sunset. For the first time, Alex saw something like life stir behind her carefully restrained expression. Not joy, usefulness. Understood, Lydia said. By evening, Blackwake had changed again. Not physically, not yet, but structurally. Where before it had been Alec's will forcing order onto chaos, it now had the first signs of division of labor. Garen handled construction and maintenance. Thomas and Perrin moved materials. Darren and Mac provided the muscle needed to scale anything heavy. Olin observed process efficiency with the quiet greed of a man who understood trade. And Lydia, without being told twice, reorganized Alec's entire storage system into a rough but readable inventory method by source, grade, and purpose. When she presented it at dusk, Garen frowned at the scratched tally slate in her hands, as if it were an insult to honest labor. What in the abyss is this? Account, Lydia said flatly. We can see the jars with our eyes. She looked at him. Can your eyes tell you how many usable vessels we'll have left in 10 days if current breakage continues? Garen opened his mouth, then closed it. Thomas tried and failed to hide a grin. Alec took the slate from Lydia and read it in silence. Her count was exact, neat, useful. More importantly, it revealed weaknesses he had been too buried in the work to notice clearly. Clay loss during rushed firing, cloth waste during repeated filtering, insufficient sealed storage for better refined batches, and a growing mismatch between crude collection speed and refinement capacity. He looked up from the slate. Good, he said. Only one word. Yet Lydia's posture shifted almost imperceptibly, as though she had been waiting longer for approval than she cared to admit. That night, Bram remained on the island longer than usual to observe. He walked the perimeter of the growing work zone with Alec while the others ate near the fire. You've changed the place faster than I expected, Bram admitted. I had reason. You also had luck. Alec glanced at him. Luck brought me one buyer. The rest was work. Bram chuckled. Fair enough. They stopped near the eastern cove where Garen had begun marking out support lines for a future landing structure. It was crude now, just stakes, rope, and cut stone, showing intention more than completion. But the shape of it was there. Alec looked down toward the surf. This cove needs a proper dock. It'll cost. So will not having one. Bram looked sideways at him. You're thinking bigger now. I was always thinking bigger. I just lacked hands. And now, Alec let his gaze drift back toward the fires where workers who had arrived as drifters and debt-broken labor were now eating from the same pot beneath organized shelter on an island the kingdom considered worthless. Now I lack time, he said. Bram was quiet for a moment. Then he asked the more dangerous question. What happens when someone in the capital hears about you? Alec's expression did not change. Then they hear. That's not an answer. It is. Panic changes nothing. No, Bram said. But preparation does. Alec looked at the dark sea beyond the cove. Then I'll prepare. The captain exhaled through his nose. You really mean to force your way back into the kingdom's sight? No. Bram frowned. No? Alec's voice stayed low and level. I mean to become too valuable to remove a second time. That answer followed Bram all the way back to his ship. Over the next 3 weeks, Blackwake began to transform in ways even Alec had not fully imagined when he first lit crude oil in a cracked pot. The worksite became a settlement, small at first, rough, almost ugly in its stubborn practicality, but real. A second shelter went up beside the workshop for tools and stored product, then a third, simpler structure for sleeping. Stone paths were laid where mud and spilled oil had made the slope treacherous. A larger clay kiln was built inland, away from the refining fires. Rainwater channels were expanded. The eastern cove gained its first fixed unloading frame, making it possible for cargo to move ashore without every landing becoming a battle against the tide. And always the oil kept coming. Blackwake bled its black wealth without end. Alec expanded the collection network carefully. He assigned Darren and Mac to assist in cutting safer paths down the southern shelves, with rope anchors hammered into stone where needed. Thomas and Perrin handled jar transport. Olin, proving more useful than expected, began recording which seep sources yielded the best refining results under Lydia's reorganized system. For the first time, Alec had enough information to compare output over time. That changed his thinking again. Not just labor, not just sales, planning. Now Blackwake could be managed. One evening as wind battered the unfinished walls of the sleeping shed, Lydia brought Alec a fresh tally slate and laid it beside his work table. We're running out of clean cloth faster than expected, she said. I know. No, she replied. You knew we were using a lot. You did not know this much. He looked at the slate. She was right again. At current growth, refining would stall within 2 trade cycles unless he secured more filter cloth, tighter sealed vessels, and larger receiving containers. The island was growing, but growth was beginning to reveal its own costs. Alec leaned back slightly. What do you suggest? Lydia folded her arms. You ask that as though you aren't already planning 3 steps ahead. I asked. She held his gaze for a moment, then answered. Stop selling all of the top-grade fuel immediately. Keep a reserve. Use the lower grades for common trade. Build consistency first, reputation second, scale third. And on Bram's next return, buy supply capacity before comfort. Alec gave her a long look. Then the corner of his mouth moved barely. That sounds like port accounting. That sounds like survival with arithmetic. Same thing in the capital. For the first time, Lydia actually smiled. It was brief, but real. Alec said nothing more, though. Inwardly, he adjusted his plans at once. That was the true value of Blackwake's new people, he realized. Not just labor, perspective. Every one of them carried a piece of the larger machine he was building, whether they understood it or not. Near the end of the third month, Bram returned once again. And this time he did not come alone. Behind the morning tide sailed another vessel, a lean coastal trader flying no noble banner, but clearly following Bram's lead. Alec stood at the ridge and watched both ships approach the cove in tightening circles. Beside him, Garen grunted. "That's new." "Yes," Alec said. "Good new or bad new?" Alec's eyes narrowed slightly as men moved on the deck of the unfamiliar ship, already looking toward Blackwake with interest too sharp to be innocent. "That," he said, "depends on how expensive curiosity intends to become." Below them, the settlement fires burned against the gathering dusk. Rows of finished jars waited beneath covered storage. The workshop smoke rose steady. Workers moved with purpose between structures that had not existed a month earlier. Blackwake was no longer hidden. It had become visible. And visibility, Alec knew, was the first price of power. As the second ship lowered anchor in his waters, the exiled knight rested one hand on the hilt of the blade the kingdom had failed to take from him, and stared down at the island he was dragging into history. The dead rock was learning to breathe. Soon the world would hear it. The second ship had barely anchored off Blackwake's coast before the mood of the entire island changed. Until now, Alec Arden's business had grown in silence. A few ships, a few careful deals, a few desperate men turned into loyal workers. Blackwake was still something hidden, valuable, yes, but not yet important enough to shake the mainland. That changed the moment the second merchant ship arrived behind Bram Voss, because it meant one thing. Blackwake was no longer a secret. Standing on the ridge above the harbor, Alec watched the unfamiliar vessel rock against the dark waters, while the lamps of his settlement burned below like scattered stars. Just a few months ago, this island had been a grave the king had thrown him into. Now, smoke rose from workshops, workers moved between storage sheds, and merchants were crossing dangerous waters just for the chance to buy what he made. The dead island was breathing, and it was starting to make money. Bram came ashore with his usual lazy grin, but the man behind him was different. Well-dressed, sharp-eyed, and clearly richer than any smuggler Alec had dealt with so far, the newcomer introduced himself as Roth Calwyn, a coastal merchant whose ships supplied ports, workshops, and shipyards along the southern trade lanes. The moment Roth saw Blackwake with his own eyes, his expression changed. He had expected a rumor. What he found instead was the beginning of an industry. Rows of sealed fuel jars sat beneath covered sheds. Workers moved with discipline. Fires burned in controlled pits. Clay vessels dried in neat lines. Even the harbor, rough as it still was, had begun to function like a real loading point. For a long moment, Roth simply stared. Then he looked at Alec and said, "This is far bigger than I was told." Alec answered calmly, "Then someone gave you an incomplete report." That one line was enough to tell Roth exactly what kind of man he was dealing with. Not a desperate exile, not a lucky scavenger, a builder. Roth inspected the fuel at once. He tested the flame, watched the burn, checked the smoke, and even examined the heavier oil residue Alec had begun shaping into lubricant. The more he saw, the more serious he became, because this was no longer just a strange product from a cursed island. This was something ports would pay for, shipyards would need, merchants would compete over, and Roth realized it before he even finished the first sample. He turned to Alec and went straight to business. "I want regular supply rights." Bram nearly laughed. Alec didn't even blink. "No." Roth frowned slightly. "You refused quickly. You asked quickly." For a moment the air between them tightened. Then Alec stepped forward and made the balance of power clear. He told Roth exactly what Blackwake would and would not become. He would sell. He would trade. He would expand. But he would not hand control of his future to the first wealthy merchant who arrived smelling profit. If Roth wanted Blackwake's fuel, then he would pay properly, bring tools, cloth, casks, and metal, and keep his mouth shut where the royal court was concerned. No exclusive rights, no hidden ownership, no tricks. Roth listened. Then slowly he smiled, because now he understood the truth. Blackwake's fuel was valuable, but Alec Arden was even more dangerous than the oil. He negotiated like a man who had already been betrayed once and had no intention of ever being cornered again. By sunset, the deal was done. Roth would bring supplies and buy in bulk. Bram would keep his share for helping Blackwake rise first, and Alec would keep full control over the island, the product, and its growth. It was the first real commercial agreement in Blackwake's history, and the moment it was sealed, the island entered a completely different stage. Because this time the ships did not just take fuel away, they brought the future with them. When the unloading began the next morning, even Garin Hale went silent for a few seconds. Bundles of cloth, stacks of iron fittings, new tool heads, proper casks for storage, nails, hooks, copper links, hammer shafts, saw blades, food reserves. For months Blackwake had survived on scrap and stubbornness. Now for the first time it had resources. That changed everything. Within days, Alec pushed the island into full expansion. The harbor was enlarged. The storage sheds doubled. A second refining line was built, then a third. More workers arrived with Bram and Roth on later trips. Debt-ridden sailors, blacklisted craftsmen, laborers with nowhere else to go, and men who had heard that on Blackwake hard work actually earned food, silver, and a future. Alec accepted them carefully. Not all at once, not without rules, but he accepted enough. And Blackwake grew fast, very fast. The narrow work camp became a settlement. The settlement became a port, and the port became a place merchants started planning around. Every week more lamps burned across the island. More roads were cut into the black stone. More houses rose near the workshops. More crude flowed from the cliffs. More silver entered Alec's hands. The island the king had called worthless was now producing the most sought-after lamp fuel in the southern sea. And Alec wasn't done. He improved the refining enough that his better batches began burning cleaner and longer than cheap whale oil. The heavier residue became a rough but highly effective lubricant for ship parts, cart axles, dock pulleys, and mill machinery. Suddenly, Blackwake wasn't just selling light. It was selling function. Ships wanted it. Workshops wanted it. Dockyards wanted it. Even better, there was no one else in the kingdom producing anything like it at scale, which meant that little by little, without announcing it to the world, Alec Arden was doing something terrifying. He was building a monopoly. One evening, as another cargo run left the harbor loaded with sealed casks, Lydia brought Alec the latest ledger and placed it on the table in his workroom. He read it once, then again. The numbers were no longer small. Blackwake had crossed the point of survival weeks ago. Now it was making real money. Not noble house wealth yet, not royal treasury wealth, but enough that Alec could feel the next stage approaching. With more labor, more ships, and one proper dock, the island would explode in value. Garin looked over his shoulder at the records and let out a low whistle. That much? Alec closed the ledger, and this is still the beginning. Outside, the sound of hammers echoed across the growing settlement. Men shouted over rope lines. Fires roared in the refining pits. Lamps burned along the roads. The harbor stayed busy long after dark. Blackwake no longer looked like exile, it looked like ambition. That same week, Roth returned with another offer. Bigger ships, broader routes, faster distribution. This time, he came less like a man trying to take advantage of a hidden producer, and more like a merchant trying not to be shut out of history. That was the real shift. People were no longer looking at Blackwake and asking whether it could succeed. They were now asking how big it was going to become. And Alec gave them the only answer that mattered. Big enough that none of you will ignore it again. Bram loved that line so much he laughed for nearly a full minute. But Alec meant every word. From that point on, the growth of the island became impossible to stop. More workers arrived, then families, then small traders hoping to attach themselves to Blackwake's rise. What had begun as one man scraping crude oil from seaside rock was now becoming a harsh, smoky, money-soaked frontier town. The first proper inn was little more than a reinforced shed, serving soup and watered ale, but it stayed full. A tool market began forming near the harbor. Labor crews competed for wages. Ship captains started adjusting routes just to dock there. Blackwake had become a real economic hub. And with every passing week, Alec's name spread farther. Not publicly, not yet, but in the language that mattered most. Merchant whispers, dockyard rumors, quiet conversations between men who knew where money was moving. They spoke of an island lord with no title, a dead island that sold light, a man exiled by the king who was now earning more in a month than some noble saw in a year. That was where the danger began, because whispers did what ships eventually always did. They traveled north, far from Blackwake and taverns near the trade lanes and counting houses and port offices and in the private rooms of lesser nobles with business interests on the southern coast. One rumor kept resurfacing. Alec Arden was alive. Not only alive, thriving. And the island he had been sent to die on was becoming rich. Back on Blackwake, Alec stood at the edge of the harbor one night and watched his settlement glow beneath rows of oil lamps made from his own refining. Garin came to stand beside him. "So," the old shipwright said, looking over the harbor crowded with cargo men and firelight, "does it feel like a grave anymore?" Alec looked at the island in silence, at the workshops, the workers, the roads, the loaded ships, the black cliffs still bleeding wealth into his hands. Then he answered, calm and cold, "No." He turned his eyes toward the dark northern horizon where the kingdom lay beyond the sea. "It feels," Alec said, "like the king's greatest mistake." And somewhere far from Blackwake's burning lamps and rising wealth, the first real whisper of his name reached the mainland. Once the rumor started, Blackwake changed again. Before, merchants came to the island because they needed fuel. Now they came because they were afraid of being late. That fear made Alec richer than any refining breakthrough ever could. Within weeks, ships began appearing one after another along Blackwake's coast. Some were small traders hoping to secure a few casks before prices rose again. Others were larger merchant vessels carrying metal, timber, cloth, grain, tools, and laborers willing to work under brutal conditions if it meant steady pay. Even captains who once laughed at the idea of docking near a cursed exile island now adjusted their routes just to see if the stories were real, and every one of them left with the same conclusion. The stories had undersold it. Blackwake was no longer some hidden operation run by a lucky exile. It had become a living, growing port. The harbor expanded first. Under Garin Hale's direction, the rough landing point was torn apart and rebuilt into something far more useful. Heavy supports were driven into the shallows. Stone foundations were laid higher into the cove. Cargo ramps were widened. Rope cranes and pulley frames were added. It still wasn't elegant, but it no longer looked temporary. It looked permanent. And permanence changed how people behaved. More workers stayed. More traders invested. More labor crews offered contracts. Soon the shoreline that had once greeted Alec with nothing but wet stone and silence was crowded with stacked casks, hauled, cargo-shouting workers, and ships waiting their turn to unload. Above the harbor, the island kept growing. New housing rows were built for workers. Storage warehouses rose near the refining lines. Kilns burned day and night. The first real market street appeared beside the lower road where tool sellers, food vendors, cloth traders, and rough little taverns began feeding off Blackwake's success like hungry birds around a war camp. Even the nights felt different now. When Alec had first arrived, Blackwake had been swallowed by darkness the moment the sun fell. Now the roads glowed with rows of lamps fueled by the island's own oil. From the sea, Blackwake looked like a city being born. And at the center of all of it stood Alec Arden, not as a knight, not as an exile, not anymore. He had become something else. The workers had started calling him Lord of Blackwake behind his back weeks ago. Now they were saying it to his face. At first, Alec ignored it. Then he stopped correcting them, because titles given by kings could be stripped away. Titles given by men who worked, bled, and built under your rule were much harder to erase. His influence grew with the island. Alec organized labor crews, expanded the refining system, and pushed Blackwake into full production. He divided the oil business into clear branches: lamp fuel, lower grade bulk stock, and lubricant, and each one began bringing in serious coin. Lydia turned the ledgers into an actual operating system. Olin tracked incoming buyers and outgoing supply. Garin ruled construction like a sea-worn tyrant. Thomas and Perrin trained newer workers. Darren and Mac became the muscle that kept order in the harbor when tempers flared. And tempers did flare, because Blackwake was making too much money too quickly. Merchants began bidding against each other for supply. Ship captains fought over loading priority. Laborers arriving late demanded wages they had not earned. Petty thieves and opportunists started appearing with the growth, hoping to take a piece of the island before its rules settled. Alec crushed that nonsense early. One smuggling crew tried to steal sealed lamp fuel from the lower sheds under cover of fog. By sunrise, they were tied to broken dock posts in front of the harbor, while every worker on the island walked past them.